Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this innovation conversation with Riel Miller. We're very pleased to have Riel with us today, and I'm particularly pleased to co-host with our good colleagues and friends from GovLab, Stefan and UNDP and Gina. They're both big proponents of both innovation and the sort of work that we'll hear about today about collective intelligence and how to tackle this complexity of the future. And I think are really an asset for organizations such as ours. What we'll do today, we have about an hour, so welcome everyone. We won't go around the table now to introduce ourselves. We'll have a Q&A after the main session, and then I would ask you to introduce yourself at that stage. Without further ado, I think I'll turn it over to you, Stefan. Is that the router show? And then very briefly, Gina, you'll come in as well before we go into the main conversation.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Great. Well, thanks so much to UNDP for hosting us and for organizing this. And I'm delighted to give a 1-minute introduction to Riel. And Riel and I know each other for, I guess, more than 20 years or 20 years since when you were at the OECD or before. And I've always been a big fan of Riel's work on forecasting, but especially on his attempts to develop a science of anticipation. And I think there's a lot going on in the forecasting environment, but there is not that much going on with regards to actually really providing for a scientific underpinning of forecasting and especially a science of anticipation. And I would say that's a really important element to position Riel up front. But the second element that I always enjoyed with Riel was the notion that there is no one single future, and that the whole attempt through actually a methodology to identify a variety of futures, I think, is a very important scientific enterprise as well. And we can only benefit from actually Riel's efforts and achievements in the field to build this science of anticipation to identify a variety of futures that we then can ultimately use for innovation or use for ultimately anticipation, as Riel would say.
Hi, everybody. My name is Gina Lucarelli. I'm team leader for knowledge and innovation at the UN Development Operations Coordination Office. So our job, we're called the Silo Fighters. That's our blog. And that is our job. We bring together the 40 agencies of the UN working in 165 countries globally. So we've been working, of course, with UNESCO, but specifically with Riel Miller, who's the head of Futures Literacy at UNESCO for a while now, to try to inject futures thinking in the way that we do our development planning and the way we advise governments and the way we engage citizens in how we're seeing the future and how we're imagining it. So this is really sort of critical for us. It's just at the nature of sustainable development. You simply can't do sustainable development without thinking about the future. The definition itself, right, is making sure those future generations have what we have now, at least, is our hope. So we're really, really glad to have Riel Miller here with us today. Riel is one of those people who, if you didn't love him so much, you'd hate him, because he bridges this sort of, he's involved in hundreds of projects, and he's working at UNESCO, and then he's publishing like crazy and thinking, and when he speaks, you really do want to, pick up your pen, would be my advice, or however you memorize things, activate your chip, whatever that is. But huge thanks to you, and we're really looking forward to hearing about your new book, which is just dropped, which is Transforming the Future, Anticipation in the 21st Century. So over to you, Riel. We're really looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you, one and all. Very glad to be here. It's a real privilege. Thank you for the kind words, and it's nice to know that when you're out there, kind of like chipping away at things and trying to push the envelope, that it inspires and it gets feedback and creates community. So this is something that's been the outcome of a lot of engagement, primarily on the designer, a practitioner, I started in 1988 with my first large foresight exercise. And it's by building up that community of practitioners and through the experience with asking people to think about the future that I've been able to develop, I think, a broader foundation, and particularly, as has already been mentioned, the challenge of diversifying the way we use the future. But even prior to diversification, you need to know that you're actually using the future. And that's one of the curious things about the future, is that we use it all the time, but we actually don't pay a lot of attention because we take it for granted. And we need to take it for granted. And in fact, before we can even walk or talk, babies have incorporated anticipatory systems in their way they exist. So this is one of the fascinating challenges. How do we take something that's so central, so visceral in the sense that we depend on it, so crucial for hope, for fear, and begin to get a little bit more sophisticated in the way we put it to use? Because despite its centrality for things like sustainability or technological change and forecasting and extrapolation and all those things, the actual question of what is the future hasn't been thought about very much. There's really not been that much work done on it. So you'll see as I present so I think I'll throw up the slides, what's going on here. And so, I don't know, should we go to the...
Yes. Wow, it's like Star Wars.
Infinity.
That is the future.
It's in the distance, just like.
Yeah.
Okay, there we go. How to build futures literacy. So I'm going to try and put the emphasis on the practical side of things. There's the book, Transforming the Future Anticipation of the 21st Century. It will be out in Creative Commons, free PDF, according to the publisher Routledge, on the 30th. So that's something that we can look forward to. So, illiterate, right for free help. This is often the way it feels when talking about futures literacy, because people don't even, it's like, you can't even ask for help because you can't read the sign. And this is really true, is that I don't know how many people here or that have been asked, let's have a conversation about the future of gender or inclusion or human rights or a refugee camp or a school. And they say, okay, we're supposed to think about the future. Let's do it. How are we going to do that? What techniques are we going to use? What images are we going to use? Do you know it? Do you know it? And there's this kind of thing. There must be somebody here who knows the future of teleconferencing. I mean, where's the expert? And in the world full of experts, well, now we have the internet, we'll find the expert. And I mean, there's all sorts of reactions, and there's anxiety. Because you're supposed to know the future in that context. And if you're an expert, you're really supposed to know the future, so that people get anxious, and that it creates all these inhibitions. But I think we can overcome all that, so we can begin to build literacy in the same way that somebody's introduced to the alphabet. And from the alphabet, they get words, and from words, they get, paragraphs, and from paragraphs, they get, all sorts of incredible things, because the world opens up from novels to poetry to reports of all kinds. So what is futures literacy? Futures literacy, as I've just said, is a capability. So I want to be very, very kind of definitive about this. It is not a method or a technique. In the same way that reading and writing is not a method or a technique, it's a capability. The way in which you become literate, learn to read and write, as we know from cognitive science, as we know from advances in learning methods, is that different methods work for different people. So futures literacy as a capability can actually be acquired in many different ways and with many different tools. It's the capacity of different ways to use the future. Now, the different ways of using the future depend on the two basic aspects of kind of the world around us. What is it? It's a solid object. And how do I understand it? How do I know it? The epistemology. So here, why we use the future, what kind of future do we use, and the how to know the different kinds of futures. Now the key kind of, I think, aha is, well, if I knew that there were different kinds of futures, then maybe I would know that I need to use different techniques to know them. But since I don't know that there are different kinds of futures, I don't really understand what this is about. So that's sort of the key first step, to begin to realize that there are different kinds of futures. And as a practitioner, my intuition told me that long ago. But I didn't have a lot of underpinnings and theories and kind of, philosophical reflection around it. And over the years, because I've been on the lookout for that, I've been able to collect some of it. So whether it's things like Henry Bergson on novelty or Robert Rosen on anticipatory systems, there's really quite a body of knowledge connected to this, but not very, how can I put it, in the orthodox or in the mainstream. Because in the mainstream, there's kind of some old think, and this is about social science and about progress in human thinking. There's kind of some old think which is deterministic. And so, but even people like Karl Popper, who I cite in the book, makes the point that for biologists and physicists, we no longer live in a deterministic world. We live in a creative universe. So complexity is not just extra complication. Complexity is actually a different state. Complexity is emergent and full of novelty. So as we have come to understand complexity better, but also to understand things like, well, what's these weird ideas around quantum and space and time and all that, we begin to question the kind of linearity and, I would say, reductionist simplicity of our thinking. Now that's helpful because it allows us to establish, I think, a broader understanding of what is the future. It might seem kind of irrelevant, but I think it's important from a scientific perspective to say that a single-celled organism has an anticipatory system built into it through evolutionary processes. But you might think of it more easily as a tree that loses its leaves. The tree's not conscious, but because the tree has evolved in time-space, its evolutionary development has integrated the fact that when the sun and the temperature all start to change, it loses its leaves because that kind of tree survives better if it loses its leaves when winter arrives. But if a cat's waiting for a mouse, it's also got an anticipatory system. So anticipatory systems are all around us, conscious and unconscious. And Robert Rosen, as I mentioned, who's a mathematical biologist, integrates the definition into the definition of life, anticipatory systems. So that's just to sort of give you an underpinning for why it makes sense and it's important to actually distinguish these different kinds of future. And so when I say diversify the way we use the future, you need to have different kinds of futures to think about. So the problem is it's invisible. Because if I ask you what your anticipatory assumptions are, or what kind of future you're thinking of, you're going to say, huh? What? Didn't know that I was doing that. So in the beginning of the book, for instance, I make the comparison with physics, where theoreticians, without seeing particles, can't see particles, physics particles, electrons, you can't see them, nevertheless have hypotheses about these particles. And on the basis of those hypotheses, they said, how can we devise some tests? How can we reveal them? And we got particle accelerators and cyclotrons. They're not the only way to observe particles. I think there's other techniques for neutrinos and all kinds of, but it's a theory leading experimentation, laboratories, techniques to render the invisible visible. So that's why I put the microscope up there, invented in the 17th century. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the microscope, it rendered something invisible in a drop of water, bacteria, little things swimming around that you couldn't see with the naked eye. It rendered them visible, but it didn't explain to us what they are. Monsters. Yeah, but what kind of monster? What happened? 100 years later, doctors started washing their hands because those bacteria in that water were killing people. But it took us quite a while to figure that out and to see, even though we had a tool that rendered the invisible visible, what was its significance? So here again, I'm trying to say, as we begin to develop an understanding of anticipatory systems, we really are not entirely sure what it's good for. And as we start to expose the way people use the future in different ways, we're again not entirely sure how this is going to change the world around us. In the same way, and we can only read about it, when it was discovered in the West, in Europe, that the Earth was not flat, and that the Earth went around the sun rather than the opposite, that realization changed where the monsters were from. The monsters weren't at the edge of the Earth anymore. Falling off the edge of the Earth wasn't something to be afraid of. But that meant you had to actually change your imaginary. You had to change your language. So today, when we speak about the future, when we speak about what we're afraid of, when we speak about what we hope for, from my perspective, we're using a language that's flat Earth. Because we haven't thought about how anticipation really enters into the world around us. So, having said all that, the what, why, and how of imagining the future, I want to emphasize, as I already said right at the beginning, that I do this practically. So here are some of the futures literacy laboratories that UNESCO has been able to run over the last 5 years as part of a proof of concept phase of an innovation process. Most of you are probably familiar with the idea of an innovation process. You have a problem, you have an issue, and then you want to see if one of the possible solutions holds water. Does the proof of concept work? Then you need to prototype it. We're actually entering into the prototyping stage now. I'll get to that towards the end. But this was the proof of concept phase. And just to give you a sense of the diversity of topics and issues, but that's pretty self-evident. Give me an example of something where the future doesn't matter. Well, maybe history in the past, but even history matters for the future. So it doesn't matter what the topic is. It could be a corner cafe, it could be the UN, it could be a government, it could be your children, it could be your own career, whatever. The future matters. And the future is part of almost every conversation, either explicitly or implicitly. So there's the design principles for these futures literacy labs. Now let me make it very clear. As I said, I needed to invent a microscope so that I could see what's in the drop of water. I needed to try and find some way to reveal the fundamental unit, or at least that's what I've called it, called anticipatory assumptions. Now, anticipatory assumptions. Why? There's something very peculiar about the future. It can only conscious thinking about the future, human conscious thinking about the future. It can only be imaginary. Anybody here go there? Anybody here bring back evidence? Anybody here touch the future? Can't do it. Imagine. But our imaginations have this peculiar characteristic. They need to be Disneyfied. They need mise en scène. They need a stage. They need props. They need variables. They need a narrative. They need a structure for the narrative. So to make the future sort of exist, you have to imagine it. And if you're imagining different kinds of future in different ways, one of the techniques is to get people to engage, to learn and to render explicit the tacit anticipatory assumptions that we work with all the time. And one of the other really critical factors here is that our anticipatory assumptions that are tacit are also often rooted in our culture and our history and our locality and the time of day and our age and what happened to us this morning and what we think is going to happen to us this afternoon. In other words, they're very, in some senses, fragile because you have to create them. You have to kind of search them out. Moving tacit to explicit, as people like Nonaka and others, theories of people who've worked on collective intelligence, knowledge management. This is not something that you can just say, and I was saying this earlier, if you throw the SDGs, which are ideas about the future at people, you're already really structuring their thinking. If you want to access and get them to feel authentic and connect to their own anticipatory systems, it's important to be, I think, a little more inviting and respectful and create that space where people can bring forward their hopes and their fears, their ways of thinking about the world around them, rooted in their ideas of time and rooted in their particular situation, rather than saying, you should be like whoever the hero or heroine is, big brother, big sister, why don't you catch up to them? Why don't you take their mindset? Why don't you take their goals? And that should be yours. Well, oh dear, it's anxiety, it's alienating. So in constructing a learning by doing process intended to reveal people's anticipatory assumptions, the lead up and the co-creation of the context in which people will be invited to access their own idea of the future is really a quite delicate and something that we're doing research on. And somebody who has said it sounded like anthropology. That was Gina was saying that it is partly that. So collective intelligence, knowledge creation processes are all around us. There's nobody in the room, I think, who hasn't done a sticky notes, innovation lab kind of thing. But have you ever wondered why is it that that's popular now? It's like 20 years ago, though, that wasn't so popular. I mean, there was a little bit of it with Edward Bono's, the Bono's stuff around, red hats, green hats, and stuff like that. And people were always saying meetings for Garden, too many meetings, but what are meetings for? But the idea that we were inviting people to express themselves, put their stuff up on the wall, let us share it, negotiate shared meaning, that's happening all over the place. And I think that's symptomatic of something bigger, which to me is redressing of the imbalance between generality and specificity, which I think is connected to complexity. But collective intelligence knowledge creation processes, I believe, have a design discipline underpinning them. Now that's a whole other discussion in a sense, but if we're going to do learning by doing, this is the fundamental Metaframe. And this is not new, this is Dewey from the beginning of the 20th century. And frankly, I mean, this goes, I think, for indigenous as much as for Western for thinking, is that the learning cycle in humans starts with the recognition that you don't know something. This is good. Ignorance is not bad. It's just staying ignorant that's probably not so great. So the idea that you don't know something, for instance, what I've been talking about here, do you understand what anticipatory assumptions are, is an invitation to explore. And that's the underlying design principle behind Futures Literacy Labs. So we start from tacit to explicit, reveal existing anticipatory assumptions, and believe it or not, it's relatively easy to do if you've constructed the context appropriately, because people have this in their minds. People care about the future, they're thinking about the future, they just don't articulate it very much. And if you create the kind of right context, being able to have an authentic discussion with the negotiation of shared meaning is doable. But there's a realization pretty quickly when people are thinking about the future of clean water or the future of energy or the future of collaboration with government and the UN in Uganda, the way we were talking about yesterday. Start to think about it, you realize my ideas of the future are pretty cliche. I'm repeating things that I've heard in the newspaper and amongst others, and I'm kind of thinking about the future like I want to colonize it. And this is very common because that's kind of the dominant framework. And it generates a sense of, well, discomfort in a way because future's too hard. Please find the economist to do the forecast or the astrologer to tell me about the future because it's too much. So there's the moment of inkling of ignorance, and that's when I think it's quite important, and this is part of the design of the process of Futures Literacy Laboratory, is like theater in 3 acts. In the first act, you have the enigma, the intrigue that gets launched. In the second act, which is the kind of complicated one where you have to do the sleuthing and the detective work, you have to try and invent things, test things, experiment, see if you can uncover what the intrigue has invited you to seek. That's the steep part of the learning curve, but it's also empowering because there you're actually pursuing your own awareness and knowledge, and you're building up an understanding. And finally, and this is one of the very important aspects of running Futures Literacy Labs, and one of the, I think, strong results that's in the book about proof of concept, which is I can run a futures literacy lab that takes 2 years or 4 hours and pretty much get people to ask new questions at the end. Meaning they will have what we technically call ontological expansion, meaning something that didn't exist for them relative to their knowledge will come into existence. Okay? And they will have made a move that expands their perception of reality. This is not a choice. This is not a decision. This is not a future goal. It's simply perceiving the world differently. So, this uses narrative capacity, collective intelligence, the capacity to reframe. It produces new questions, hence capacity to use the future, a change in the conditions of change, because the people who participate in the process have actually changed their own context. And it provides evidence of anticipatory assumptions, which is good for my research. And it also provides insights into designing processes. How do we make the microscope better? So that's what Futures Literacy Labs have been doing over the last little while. It allows us to think, I think, more effectively about change within the system, change outside the system, inside in, inside out, and outside out change, innovation. And what's really interesting here is that if I ask somebody to describe the future, their expected future, and because they cannot describe it without revealing their anticipatory assumptions, I've essentially invited them to describe their box. Outside the box thinking, what a great idea, but how do we do it? Well, if you invite people to talk about the future, they will describe their box because they will describe their assumptions. And so that provides us with a way to distinguish strategic difference from tactical difference. For 6 years in Paris, I taught a course called Reform versus Transformation. How do you know the difference? How do you begin to distinguish between the two? So let me just elaborate on that a little bit. And I think it has to do with the utility of doing this in a UN context. Like, why is it useful? If we think about discontinuity and continuity, reaction and preparation, improvisation and unprecedented, we begin to see that there's reform, which attempts to ensure continuity, right? And it's reactive and preparatory. So, might I say, a lot of the work around sustainable development goals is in that category. How do we improve our schools? How do we improve our governance systems? How do we improve X, Y, and whatever? On a trajectory that is largely projecting the past into the future and largely wants to colonize tomorrow. Meaning we want to impose our generations, just the way all of you want your grandparents to impose their ideas on you. Oh, no, you don't want that, do you? Oh dear, okay. Then why are we doing it to future generations? Why are we trying to impose our ideas on them? We wouldn't like our grandparents to impose their ideas on us. Strange thing, that. But it calls into question a little bit the way we've been thinking about the future from the point of view of simply improving what we know in order to make it permanent. So this is a kind of preservationist agenda, and it's very commonly associated with what I call the fetishism of immortality. The nation state should live forever, the company should live forever, the person should live forever. This fetishism of immortality is clearly inconsistent with our universe. That doesn't mean we don't have it, but the question is how do we begin to challenge that and go beyond it? So we obviously do it when we think about retrofit, and we do it when we also think about transitions. But how do we get to the point of discovery, creation, and invention? And since the universe around us is experimenting like crazy, the words for them. We don't know what to call them. And there's no way to know if the little seed of something that just emerged now will later on become capitalism, from mercantilism. We don't know. That the schools of the elite might eventually become a model for the schools that are compulsory education, and why and how. You can't know in advance, but you can begin to observe and you can begin to detect. And so we can enlarge our ability to perceive the world if we're able to distinguish what we're doing. And one of the things that was fascinating in yesterday's conversation, and with the fantastic work that's being done by resident coordinators as they try and inject the future into conversations, because the Sustainable Development Goals invite us to inject the future, is that that power of the future as a catalyst is there. But we're getting really mixed up, being unable to distinguish these different categories of change, these different categories of how we're using the future. So being futures literate is actually a very powerful way to begin to more effectively use the future to do all the things that we're trying to do. So the value added of futures literacy is that it allows us to actually combine the science of generality, statistics, and patterns, managerialism, which is the command and control hierarchical. I'm going to play God and determine what happens tomorrow. I believe that I have the will and the power to impose on the future what I want the future to be like. The 20th century has some considerably nasty examples of that. And experimentalism. But experimentalism relates to a capacity. If you experiment and you can't perceive what the experiment means, well, then it's just a waste. It just passes you by. So part of futures literacy is about being more able to harness experimentalism and also, and here's where the collective intelligence knowledge creation processes come into play as the microscope of the 21st century, in the way I see it, is that it allows us to actually begin to valorize and validate ephemerality and specificity. And keep this in mind, despite results-based management. What happens in a room when somebody learns something changes the world. And it can never be the same. And that is valuable, but that's process. It's not an outcome. And we don't know where it'll take us. Because all this discussion that I'm having about capacity, it could make us capable of doing horror. The fact that somebody can read or write, has that capability, does not mean they will do good things. So this, I think, dangerous promise that if we do this, the world will be better, is actually, from my point, dangerous. It's pretentious. It lacks humility. And it doesn't act, it's inconsistent with what we know scientifically about complexity and emergence and the very origins of our own species through evolution, but also critically, and we're in the room named after Sen, the capacity to be free. Freedom is related to uncertainty and unknowability. If the universe was deterministic, the capacity to be free would be irrelevant. We just have to calculate. So these are really quite central issues for finding a way to reconcile what has become a very distorted conception, glasses that we wear and that we never take off, of human agency, make a difference, and the world around us. Why become futures literate? To overcome poverty of the imagination and the temptation to colonize the future. Colonize the future. Uncertainty becomes an asset, not an enemy, reduces fear and defensiveness. It kindles hope and a diversification strategy towards resilience. So let me just sort of embellish a little bit on that point, which is that if you become more able to perceive things and to name things that didn't have a name before, if you're better able to dance, then let the music play. If you're better at playing jazz because you're practicing and you're listening to it, you can improvise. And that confidence, but also that capability, allows us to be more appreciative, more able to recognize diversity. Now, diversification as a strategy is, generally speaking, more powerful than defensiveness and insurance. Building castles and walls is really not a very resilient strategy. Resilience is to diversify, put your eggs in many different baskets. Now, I want to walk my own talk. Sometimes you put all your eggs in one basket and you win. So I'm not saying that I know this will be better, but I'm saying that what we understand in terms of resilience, the diversification tends to be a better strategy. But the question for humanity is how. So again, futures literacy is related to this. And this is my last slide. It's the kind of visual, how can I put it, irony that and maybe it's a little too strong to say that this is the SDGs kind of way of thinking, but the idea is that somehow somebody, in their wisdom, knows how to get us from A to B, and we're going to follow across the precipice and get to the promised land. Does this look like a smart way to do things? I don't think so. So there's really a fundamental question here about how we use the future. How we anticipate matters. It changes the present. And I'll add just one little point to that, which is it also implies, I think, a a responsibility and burden with respect to morality and values, which is that if we have this capacity to perceive and understand the present richer, and I think more genuine way, or it corresponds to the nature of complexity, we can act on our values now, create the world that we want in that expression, and that our legacy is not some promise. Later, the world will be better, and I'm doing it for my children. No, I'm doing it now because I see things now, and I'm improvising and planning. I'm making bets, and I'm expanding my universe in order to create a legacy that is how I am now. My being is my legacy. So this is really a different way of kind of putting the future to use. There's the title of the book. There's the email. So please don't hesitate to email me, and some social networking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very inspiring. I know I have actually questions from people already contacting me. I just want to double check. Did we lose the image at some point?
Yeah,
Okay.
but we'll
I
be
have
sending them a
Violet
slide deck.
from RDA is asking me to double check. This would be recorded, right?
Yes.
Right. So that would be available for later. But thanks very much. It was very inspiring, very broad ranging. And in my head, of course, I'm trying to figure out how does this help a large bureaucracy that loves and thrives on predictability. That's what we want to do, right? That's what we're comfortable. I want to know what the outcome is. Let me throw it open though for questions. I invite you colleagues to try to keep your question as short as possible, concise, and please introduce yourself. So the floor is open. Then I'll go to John over there.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. Tim Heine, my name, from the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office here at UNDP. Okay, do you hear me? Sorry.
Yeah, because we're also on YouTube, so it's
Okay,
good.
so I had a question to your rectangle, or these 4 images of what where future literacy was in the middle. I think 3 of the boxes were pretty self-explanatory, and I don't know if you can go back to the slide, or I also wrote it down, the 4th one, because it was experimentalism, generality, managerialism, where we kind of all have images for. But then you went to the specificity, and you took, as a nowadays example, you took the microscope. But going forward, you mentioned things like collective research and collective intelligence. Could you there describe that a little bit further, so it gets a little bit more tangible? That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to take a couple of questions, perhaps, and then we'll give you a chance to.
Yeah, John Hall from the Human Development Board Office. I also enjoyed that very much. Thank you. I think this sort of gets to the last slide, the image there. One of the risks of the sort of tunnel vision on the SDGs, or the focus you might call it, is that all sorts of things might be happening in the blind spots, and we just don't see them coming because we're too focused on our view of the future. What advice do you have for the UNDP and the UN to build that into the way we think about things?
Do you want to take one more, maybe?
Okay.
So that we get a few. I think, Owen, did you have your hand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's kind of related to this one, actually. More just a general question of, through this futures literacy lens, how, if you were allowed to change the SDGs, how would they look?
So let me. I think I can connect specificity to the answer. We live in a complex, evolving universe. There are generalities that change. There are general aspects of the world around us that evolve and that are complex. Social systems, the United Nations system, etc., that are macro, that have been growing over years and have created the bureaucracies that we're familiar with. But if one of the challenges from the perspective of trying to understand the world around us is to take into account the richness of the universe and the way the universe evolves and emerges, then time-place specificity is actually quite important. Time-place specificity is unique all the time, everywhere. It's generating this unbelievable, right here and now, richness. And we're actually experiencing And with our statistics and our common denominators and our macro structures, our nation states, we can describe the world around us without all that uniqueness, without all that specificity. And we become very talented and very effective through managerialism, through bureaucracy, through command and control, through prescience, the desire to know the future as if it existed and to predict it and to bet on it, to talk about generalities. And industrial society privileges hugely scale and norms. And thank you to all the people whose first language is not English. I'm able to speak English. It's a norm, it's a general, and we understand the power of that. And industrial societies, with the huge gains that we've made through economies of scale, have dominated the world. And so we have this incredible bias towards generality and statistics as a way to describe, understand, and control. And yet, meaning, identity, experience are specific. They're collective, they're communal, because most of our experiences actually are with us in societies, in cities, in context. And much of our experience is about expressing, exchanging, and so it's relational. So the shift from a kind of an objectivist, deterministic ontology towards relational, emergent, complex ontologies is really a very fundamental shift. And part of that, to come to the second issue, is to say these developmental approaches, which are characteristic of this fantasy that you can somehow reproduce the OECD trajectory, is a dangerous delusion. Because for one thing, it does violence to history. It's not the way it happened. They didn't know it was going on. They didn't know what they were doing. And it was not some prescient leader who somehow made the genius decision to do this. And so one of the critical questions becomes, how do we become more humble, but also more empowering? And so it is very subversive to a certain extent of the message of the current model of leadership, which is, I know, and I'm going to take you there. And so it implies, I think, for the UN and for the SDGs are fine. They're emulation, catch-up, convergence, and I'm very glad to have a next generation phone because it's an improvement. So I'm not against improvement. But the question is, what are we improving it for? And is that where the meaning of things come from? And I think one of the critical factors is how to respect and embed hopes and fears in what people themselves know. And again, this means not colonizing their thinking, and also, I think, reducing our desire to colonize the future, to impose our idea of the future on the future. This is a very, very significant shift from the lessons of the 19th century, which we are still living with. Weber, bureaucracy. And so private or public sector. And it is very uncomfortable, as you mentioned, for these big bureaucracies that want to be able to know and to promise that they know and to deliver on what they know. But I would, I don't think I'm saying anything kind of out of school or unexpected, which is their credibility. Our credibility is pretty low for a good reason. We're setting ourselves up to fail. We're generating expectational relationships that are untenable. And so, you can either desperately, frantically try to improve them by becoming more and more results-based, more and more rigorous, run faster and faster on innovations that are pumping out the bilge of these sinking institutions. Or you can say, look, folks, there are other ways to do things, and we can have a more encouraging and open attitude towards things we don't understand, but that are about people themselves understanding their own context, their own hopes, their own fears, for them to become literate in their own future.
Thank you. That's really exactly the point that I answered. Thanks very much. Let's take a few more questions, if that's okay, maybe up to 3.
I was just curious how you actually did use your own methodology for writing your own book. So we write sometimes, we still write a lot of reports, and sometimes we write reports about similar or other things. So how you find out, or if you learn through making it, or curious.
Do you want to take this one as quite
Yeah,
specific?
that's I've only been at UNESCO for 5 years. I'm 61 years old. Okay, so I started in 1982 at the OECD, and I did my first large foresight project in 1988. So I'm a longtime practitioner. And when I arrived at UNESCO, I did that. I arrived on the basis that I was already knowledgeable in my field, and I was already somebody who was pioneering certain ideas in collaboration with other colleagues. And I came to UNESCO in some senses to reinvent and restore foresight work, because UNESCO actually has a long history in foresight work, and these things go through cycles. And it turned out that, well, you know, I'll be slightly undiplomatic about it. It turned out that the budgets of UNESCO disappeared, and essentially the only way for me to move forward was to turn to outside partners. And the Rockefeller Foundation moved in, and Innovation Norway funded, and I've been entrepreneurial all my career, and I proposed projects and said, look, these are ideas that I want to test. Now, the virtue, which, necessity is mother of invention, but also the virtue of it, is that when I run a futures literacy lab on the science, in Brazil, we actually come to conclusions that are relevant for science policy in Brazil. We also observe things about anticipatory assumptions. We also observe things about the design of futures literacy labs. We also sort of test key hypotheses. So futures literacy labs have this kind of multi-targeting that allows it to be relevant for the institutions that want policy results, but at the same time can be the pursuit of a scientific agenda. And so I was able to combine the two things for a whole bunch of reasons related to just my own path and historical happenstance. I mean, imagine if the United States had decided to continue to fund UNESCO, because I arrived when that money was withdrawn. So it's everybody knows the famous story of the horse in China, the Chinese fable.
Which one?
Yeah, which one? It's the story of the peasant who has a horse and lives out on the steppes, and the horse is their primary wealth in the family. And one day the horse escapes and runs off into the steppes. The village comes to the person in the family and says, "Oh, what a catastrophe! How terrible!" And the patriarch, as it's explained in the story, not the matriarch, the patriarch says, "Maybe." A couple of weeks later, the horse comes back with 2 more horses. Now they have 3. Whoa! Fantastic. How? And the village comes by and says, "Oh, you're so lucky. It's terrific. It's wonderful." Maybe. A couple of days later, they're breaking in the horses, and in this case, I'll tell the way the fable was told, the son breaks his leg severely, and the whole village comes in, and your eldest is now crippled. It's terrible. What a catastrophe. And the guy says, "Maybe." And 2 days later, the warlord comes by, recruits all the young men from the village who will go off to war, and not the one with the broken leg. So I'm just saying, we need to be very careful. And I feel it's actually an ethical obligation as a futurist to say maybe. Even the best intentions have unintended consequences, quite negative. And so the negative consequence of United States withdrawing was that I went off and found resources somewhere else.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the sort of point that I think everyone in the room agrees probably that to some extent that the fact that certainly the organization I'm with is under certain financial straits and circumstances, it is a major impetus to innovation around partnerships and looking at models and blended type approaches to issues. That, of course, also means there's pressure to go down the bilge and keep popping out all this little innovation. So it's very refreshing to hear that, particularly for this crowd. Yes, please.
Yes, I actually had thank you so much for the presentation. It's very inspiring. And actually had my name is Tina Malone, and I work with UNESCO Riels in New York. And I actually have 2 quick questions to you. First of all, why do you think the whole concept of futures of literacy has been so overlooked? Has it got something to do maybe the very changing nature of change itself? Because we are moving like from linear to non-linear and exponential change or something else. And then another question I had,
tools, like we have, these series of chains where that's meant to be forward looking and kind of look at, okay, what are the different scenarios and partners and challenges and what's the different pathways that might get us there, and acknowledging explicitly our assumptions in that kind of process, and then testing those assumptions as we go along, through our programming and changing course, as we get more information. Also, risk management in the past, I feel like we haven't been very good at managing risk. We kind of approach it as a risk as a deviation from our plan. But how can we look at risk as how do we navigate uncertainties that we face and use that as a tool to help us get through those uncertainties? So I'm just trying to think about how can we use this sort of futures literacy to do things differently, in our programming, using some of what we have, but in a new way. And if you've had some experience with that, working with organizations, any thoughts on that?
Very, very important questions. Briefly, and I'll connect the two again. Is that I don't think it's been overlooked. I think that genuinely we advance our thinking. It's like Copernicus, Galileo, stuff like that, scientific method. These things emerge, and I think actually thinking about complexity, the power of our tools, our desire to recognize and respect diversity, our desire to understand freedom as a capability and not just as the liberty of free molecule or whatever. Those things are shifting our thinking, and I'm not personally somebody who believes in acceleration or more or less complexity per se. I think our universe has always been complex. We paid more or less attention to it. One of the reasons why this is coming to the forefront is because we have aspirations to understand the world better and to act in ways that are more consistent with the ideas of diversity, which is not very good for bureaucracy, and generalization. Diversification implies all these differences, and bureaucracies don't much like difference. And as we go through this, I think one of the key issues is not to pretend, and this was what, actually the thing that was provoked by yesterday's conversation, but I mean it's central to what I've been doing, which is that we need to understand that if we're trying to do planning, and I'm digging a canal, or I'm holding a party you got to follow the plan, and the risk is a closed systems concept, and uncertainty isn't, and that's a really significant issue in our conceptual apparatus. We need to become better at compartmentalizing these different aspects. There are, and that's why I didn't present it here, but for me, we're really talking about two different paradigms. There's a closed systems paradigm and a semi-open systems paradigm. And one of the great challenges, I think, is to be able to go back and forth between the two. And I'm currently writing a piece on this for Roberto Poli's handbook on anticipation. If I said that, the glasses that I need to put on to see the ultraviolet spectrum are these, I don't know if it's better or worse for me to see the ultraviolet spectrum or not. In other words, the glasses I put on, I don't know if they're really the best ones because I don't know what's going to happen. So our ability to shift from risk to uncertainty, from determinism to non-determinism, that ability is not something that can be deterministically controlled. It needs to be in a capacity of kind of fluidity, the ability to switch back and forth. The one eye, two eyes, the walking on two legs. When we walk, there's always a moment of transition. And from my perspective, the issue here is to find ways of making the now more dimensional so that we have our bets and our plans and our preparedness in view. But at the same time, the humility, the openness, the questioning that allows us to appreciate emergence and the processes that are so unbelievable in this universe. Now, just one little point. If you imagine changing the conditions of change, if you imagine a society in which people can read and write, as we all know, that society can do things that an illiterate society cannot. So the way in which politics, leadership, power are incarnated, so the now, in a society where people were futures literate, or where futures literacy was generalized, would be different than it is today. Our expectations and our fear lock us into a now that is authoritarian, and which is odd for people who believe in democracy. But anyway.
Thanks very much. And colleagues, I know there's a few more questions in the room, and also I want to acknowledge we have folks connected from India and Bangladesh, and they also may have some questions. But in the interest of time, perhaps I'll ask you to come in now for if that's okay, for a final sort of summary off. And is that okay?
Great.
The
Well,
last couple of minutes.
I've been asked to try to summarize some of the lessons learned here, or at least Riel's wisdom. And I always, anyway, I'm being a limited mind, I always need mnemonics to do so. And so one mnemonic that I think was useful to myself was the acronym that appears throughout the book. By the way, the book, as we mentioned, has a set of acronyms that were forced upon Riel because of a space limitation. But one acronym that ultimately determines the book is, of course, FL, which stands, of course, for Futures Literate. And so the question I pose is that what we've heard is actually that FL means more than just futures literate, which of course in essence is about making the future visible. And I think one of the big takeaways is that actually if it would be really visible, it would be now. And so how do you actually make the future more visible through some notion of imagination? But that means that FL also means becoming fears literate, because to a large extent, fears and hopes are our anticipation attributes, that if you could actually make fears and hopes visible, or at least more manifest, you would be able to start understanding what are the attributes of anticipation. The third interpretation of FL, besides future and fears literate, is that ultimately that it allows us to become freedom literate, that it allows us to be more free about how we go about present, but also free about how we anticipate the future. And so we really get a better sense of how freedom ultimately might establish. That leads me to the fourth interpretation of FL, really, if I may, which is then flexibility literacy. Is that we don't become more future literate, we also actually become more literate about how to deal with flexibility, with diversity. And that actually flexibility is really missing quite often in the current environment, where we only bet one future and measure one future on how we go about this. But that future literacy enables us to be more flexible and provides for a flexibility literacy, which leads me to my last FL, which is then fairness literacy. Because ultimately, by being more flexible, we're also more fair to different kinds of futures, and more fair to actually different fears and hopes that you have established through futures literacy. And so if you read the book, and if you see FL, I hope you will see that FL has 5 different meanings, but that they're all connected to each other. And that's what I took away from this futures literacy today.
Thank you
very much. Thanks. Gina, do you want to come in for last word here from your perspective?
After that, it's just dropped the mic time. But I know, I do feel a little obligation to defend the Sustainable Development Goals just for a half second. So I mean, what talking to you yesterday in our leadership exchange and today has kind of made me think is this. Here's the extreme, right? So one kind of power that promises to deliver everything, doesn't care if they do, is not accountable on whatever they do, and maybe even deflects along the way to distract what they promise. And I'm not talking about anyone in specific. And the other extreme are this sort of, 169 targets that world governments agreed to achieve by 2030, including important things like eliminating extreme poverty, right? So there's sort of the checklist mentality and the sort of, I don't know what you call the other one. Let's save it, let's not. So what you are sort of offering is an alternative to these two extremes, right? So if we get more literate about talking, thinking, using the future, right, for good, we can hold power to account, right, in a more dynamic way than needling over the data and the statistics, which anyway we don't have. So that would be my futures literacy in the middle of accountability and how we interact with power.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was it.
Great.
Right, Lucas?